Thank you everyone for having me here today. I'm actually very happy to be presenting in the West Island. I work for the CU's West de Elle. I work for the CU's West Island, so certainly I am around here, based at the Douglas Institute, but like Joanne mentioned, I work also different levels in terms of health overall. I do work in fitness, I do work in mental health, I do work in substance use, so certainly this is a topic very much of not only my interest, but as any citizen, as a parent, as a health professional, it is a concern. And certainly with the changes that are coming, we are getting la demande est là. So the demands are there, like l'exigence est là, in terms of like making more presentations to our community of what this entails. So today I really want to make sure there's a lot to cover. There's going to be a few videos. I'm going to make sure that I do my best to make sure to put everything together as much as possible for you to get a good understanding of not only of substance, but how it impacts mental health, but also what are the risk factors? How can we identify them in our community? How could we actually prevent if needed? If already is happening, how could we actually make it better for people that already have some symptoms and how to actually cope with them? And at the end of the day, how to live a quality of life. That's what we all want, right? To have a good quality of life, be functional at some level of another one. So I always like to put a few quotes here and there whenever I present. Doesn't matter which topic it is. I cover many topics sometimes. And one major of them, I put it to the top, which is your genetics load the gun, your lifestyle pulls the trigger. I thought it was a good one that goes in line with what we're going to be discussing today, because each of us, we're very unique on the way we're made up. We come with what we call a genetic loading, a genetic baggage that we carry here. But then we are exposed to many things in life, and it's a long journey. It's a day-to-day of making choices, making the right choices, also having the right attitude, also how to reach certain ways to reach out to outlets, ways to cope with things. So those things actually come across all the time in our lives, right? We need to make decisions. We're surrounded by support system, but then we have within ourselves a genetic loading. It could be based on physical health vulnerabilities or mental health vulnerabilities. That we cannot change. That's the way we're born. That's what we come with. But what we can change and fully take charge of is how we're going to be heading in the future or day to day. Our decisions day to day is affecting our brain, is affecting our functioning, and also how do we react to stressors in life. That's very important. So I want to make sure that you have that in mind, because certainly drugs, substances are environmental factors that are around us on a day-to-day basis. So we hear warnings, drinking may cause memory loss, or worse, memory loss, a joke. Any drugs or alcohol, no thanks, I've got everything. I lost the ball, but it's cool, it's all cool. So what is that? It's a whole plantation of marijuana. So basically all I want to say is that a reality is that it's everywhere. It's everywhere, and most people consume it. Yeah. But what do we do as a community? What do we need to know about consumption? Because it's out there, our kids are going to be exposed to it much earlier on than what we think, and that's what it is. So I'm going to try to cover the reality in Canada in terms of like the actual numbers for substance use and who are the most vulnerable groups. Substance use and mental health, what we call also comorbidity, concurrent disorders in psychiatry, a brief summary of the different drug groups, the classification and its effects. Very important how substance affects the brain. It's good to understand it so that we know how to treat it and how to prevent it. Risk factors and protective factors, because each of us, we have some risk factors towards specific illnesses, specific conditions, but we also have protective factors, and those we can build up as we go along in life. Differences among substance use, risk behaviors, and those with established problems, and prevention and intervention and cannabis legalization. So there is quite a bit to cover today. So number one, or reality, and I want each of you to take the time to answer this question on your own. Do you recognize any of these images? Any of them? You can answer out loud yes, you can answer out loud no, you can answer internally as you wish. Do you recognize them? Yes. Have you ever consumed any of these, even if once in your life? Have you ever known of anyone who consumes on a regular basis, weekly, any of these? Do you know anyone who may have a problem with use? So, consumption is common. It's out there. It's common, but when does it become a problem? And that's the key factor. How to prevent it from becoming a problem. And this is applicable not only to substances, but to everything in life. 11% of all Canadians have a problem with alcohol or drug use. 11%. We're a 36.9 million population. 11% of those have a problem with substance use. Now, substance use in Canada, the most prevalent one is basically for males. About 80% of males who consume. I'm talking about consumption, alcohol. Women, about 65% or so, and then in total, close to 80%. Then we have tobacco next, and then we have marijuana next, and then we have other types of illicit drugs. Alcohol consumption in Quebec, I will say that actually has been pretty stable over the last 15 years. Hasn't increased. But what it has increased in alcohol is how excessive we get with alcohol in the last 15 years, especially in females. So the question is, wonder why? Why is it that females are consuming excessively more alcohol than before? There are many, many hypotheses. Okay, many. It could be related to the pressure with career. It could be the pressure in terms of, dealing with a lot of things. House, this, and it could be that. Who knows? But males, they still consume the most compared to females, but there's been an increase in excessiveness for females. Ages between 18 to 24 are the age range where they mostly consume alcohol. Okay, so very young age. Beer is the most consumed, then it comes wine. Drug use in Quebec, we see that about 83% in total don't consume any drugs, but when we talk about cannabis, we see about 12%. And this is the population of 15 and plus, 15 years and plus. Cannabis, among all the drugs in the last 12 derniers mois, according to age, with a population of 15 and up, so that one comes up as being very significant. So that has rise. Okay, we're talking about alcohol having been stable over the last few years. Cannabis hasn't. Cannabis has actually increased over the last few years. Now, what about other types of addictions? Because we talk about drugs, we talk about substance. That's not the only addiction. That's not the only thing that will become repetitive and as a habit in the brain in terms of leading to impairments in functioning. We're talking about, we have 3 images here. Can any of you, before I put the information, maybe mention what could they be? Gambling, cell phones, cyber dependence, anything, social media, all that stuff. It's not officially on what we call the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders. The number 5 version is out now. It's not officially there, but certainly there is a clear range of psychopathology there, especially when people actually become very much obsessive about it and really start neglecting socially their environment or also occupationally. Once those signs are there, that becomes a bit of a concern. So, a Quebec survey published in 2014 showed that adult participation in gambling decreased significantly in Quebec between 1996 and 2012, and participation has largely been recreational. Men are more likely than women to partake in gambling. Furthermore, people aged between 35 and 74 are more likely to gamble. The internet offers many possibilities in the field of work, education, leisure, and communication. And a significant portion of the population makes daily use of it. And the majority of these people make it a convenient, enjoyable, and harmless use. Only a small fraction of users use it problematically. This phenomenon of problematic internet use is referred to as cyber dependence. So sometimes we see it, oh, it's out there, it's big, oh, it's causing a lot of problems, but the statistics show otherwise. So that's why I'm saying that sometimes it really should be of a major concern if we see some signs of deterioration where really a person is spending too much time, where it starts changing behavior, neglecting socially, isolation starts, maybe some irritability, maybe there's some spending on money, little signs like that. Someone has to always look at the overall social and occupational picture. So to this day, there is no consensus on the diagnostic criteria for cyber dependence. In this regard, cyber dependence was registered as a trial diagnosis under pathological use of the internet. So now talking about the most vulnerable and fragile groups, and this is important because we're all exposed to substances at one level, but who are the ones that are most fragile, more vulnerable to likely develop what we call a problem, an addiction? So one, homeless, for sure. There are many reasons for it. You know, the environmental factors where they're actually being exposed, the fact they don't have a place where to be, the fact they don't have any support system, many reasons. Then we have people that have mental health disorders. Why is that? Why do you think people that have mental health disorders are more likely to have an addiction when we talk about substances? To escape from the symptoms, certainly. What else? Self-medication, yes, certainly. Anything else? Anxiety, certainly. So what happens to the brain of someone with a mental health disorder already? There is already distorted judgment. Very good. The brain already has been highly affected. By being highly affected already puts you at risk of not making the right decisions, not having the judgment to actually, or even to say no, or even to stop yourself. So that's why people that have mental health disorders, they need more support, they need more guidance, they need more coaching, and they need a lot of support in terms of making those right decisions. So that's it. Another major fragile group is here, or precious group. I call it the precious group. Yeah, or youth. And that's key. Why is that? Why is our youth and pregnant women as well, and seniors, of course, as well? But we're going back to some major ones. Youth, we're ending with seniors. Most fragile groups. Why do you think is that? Let's start with youth. Looking at the brain. When you think about anyone in your family, if you have a kid, if you have a grandchild, if you have a nephew, anyone in your entourage that is between the ages of 14 to 25, their brain is not fully developed yet. So imagine that. Imagine if you have a brain that is, their connections are not yet strong enough, that some areas of your brain, which are called executive functioning, the frontal lobe, are not fully developed. That means that a person is unable to make the right decisions, and also the emotional aspect of it too. All those areas when we're talking about the teenage ages, when there's like transitioning, there's with a lot of difficulties, right? Going into high school, trying to have a pressure, peer pressure, trying to fit, trying to make this. There's so much going on, hormonal changes. So that's the critical period. It's a critical period where most of the onset of mental health happens. And also, most of the addictions actually happen. That's why we see the ages of 18 to 24, where they're the highest one in terms of consumption when we look at stats. So that's very, very important to understand. And not only for us to understand, but also to pass the message and to be supportive of our teenagers, of our youth, that sometimes, they're unable to make those right decisions. They need a lot of support. They need a lot of understanding from, and they're being told from everywhere, because they're all covered by at school, home, this, that. They're trying to fit in. So there's a lot of stressors for sure for them. So the vulnerable groups, or youth and a brain that is still under development. Judgment lasts to develop. The judgment really fully develops up to age 25 and onwards. Of course, they'll continue being challenged by the use of good judgment. But when we talk about brain functioning, that's when actually it's fully developed. So teenager brains are still developing, and they're changing every day. These changes in the wiring make young people with alcohol more rewarding when they're adults, and increasing the potential for alcohol addiction in adulthood. Some research suggests that young people are more vulnerable than adults to some of the effects of alcohol because their minds and bodies are still developing. Research informs us that alcohol can damage the developing brain, but it's not clear how much alcohol it takes to do this. It also varies so much from person to person because of what I spoke before about the risk factors and the protective factors. Even moderate amount of drinking in teens years may cause permanent brain damage. Another group at risk that we said was mental health. And we look at the rate of gray matter loss in terms of someone who has already psychosis and someone who has a normal adolescent brain. When we understand that it's chemically and structurally impossible for the brain to function normally, when someone has mental health problems, already the neurochemistry of the brain, there is an imbalance in the brain. The structures have been dramatically changed. So by being exposed to substance, already it makes it even worse. Even though the short-term effects may be of soothing, someone who consumes marijuana or alcohol, they use it to release an anxiety. Short-term, yes, but then long-term, it starts exacerbating some symptoms. It can trigger it, it can make it worse. And it will have an effect on the medication as well. Because medication versus consuming substance is like when you take an antibiotic. They always say, don't consume alcohol with antibiotics. Why? Why is that? Why do they tell us at the doctors? Because it would actually contradict the effect of the medication. So that's why you're not supposed to do it. It's the same thing with any medication for mental health. And specifically for mental health, because it goes all the way to the area of similarly acting, which is called the reward system, where most of the mental health happens, as well as addiction. So perhaps we can better appreciate then why is the lack of affordable, accessible, comprehensive mental health care is so problematic, and it has gone through years of research, and we have advanced. I always stay positive, and I always say, yes, there's a lot of issues with our mental health system, there's a lot of issues with how we're set up, but I look back at 10 years and how much we have improved. Certainly, and there's a lot of research still going on, because it's not easy to develop a comprehensive model approach for mental health, because everything is so affected in the brain when we talk about mental health. And that's the problem. And that's the thing that we have to understand. But then we have to use what I call a multi-modal approach to mental health, which is not only medication-based, but it's also based on psychosocial support. It's also based on encouraging physical activity. It's also based on managing stress. It's based on so many factors, because everything is about this entity that we have here, which is very precious and is very fragile too. So mental illness, we see the brain of different variety of mental health disorders, from anxiety to depression to obsessive compulsive disorder to what we call post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar, and we see the normal brain. We see how different they are reacting in terms of how they face stressors, or in terms of how the neurochemistry is set up. It's very different. So that gives you already an idea. So the brain is a precious entity. Our brain needs to be worked and stimulated regularly. Even if someone feels good, even if someone feels better, even if someone does not feel good, it doesn't matter. Our brain needs constant nourishment of. How could we nourish our brain? How do you nourish your brain every day? Activity. What type of activity? Yeah. Reading. What else? Sleeping. That's key. Sleeping is very important. A good sleep, yes. Eating well, yes. Those are lovely activities. Those are great ones to nourish the brain and our body. Also very important that we're going to talk about is good social interaction. That's why they always recommend for seniors and for dementia. Social interaction stimulates those connections. It has to be good social interaction. Like this. Like this. You're seeing other people, you're discussing, you're talking, you're keeping your brain active. You're keeping your brain distracted, but in a good way. And that's very good. We need to learn to nourish it and do all the things in life to develop healthy connections between the brain, the mind, and our body. Everything is interconnected. Every single signal, action, and emotion is having an effect on brain function, or emotions, cognition, and behavior. But it's also not about being obsessive about it. We have to enjoy the process, every single process, because there's a lot out there right now in terms of healthy lifestyle, this and that, so much pressure on like being fit in terms of your mind and your body. I think it's a matter of choosing what's right for you, on what makes you happy, what keeps you healthy. If you feel strong, if you feel good with running, with eating vegetables, with eating fruit, from time to time you have your donut, from time to time you have this, that's perfectly fine. It's a matter of having a good balance. And it's the same thing with some substances. That's why we have to be very careful. It's not about the approach that we're trying to raise right now a lot in mental health services, especially right now that things are happening. We know very well. Alcohol has been legal for a very long time. Cannabis is going to be legal. What does that mean? That doesn't mean that we're going to be accepting people smoking just like that all the time at the units or anywhere else. It's same as alcohol. Same as alcohol. It's forbidden to be consumed in specific areas. And we're going to talk about legalization later. I'm not going to give you my personal opinion there. I'm just going to tell you about the facts, what it is out there. But one area that we need to be more open and more approachable, and that's what we're implementing a lot, is what we call a harm reduction approach. It's not about being completely a no. It's about how to teach our community how to manage it, how to make sure that doesn't become problematic. Because our teenagers are going to be more exposed to it, our youth is going to be more exposed to it, right? They're going to access it. Okay, they need to know what the effects are. They need to know what their weakness is. If I have a weakness, like me myself, I have a big weakness to diabetes, cardiovascular, so I need to make sure I control many areas of my life because I don't want to develop it later on in life. So if someone has a vulnerability, it's a matter of understanding. Okay, if I'm going to be drinking this, if I'm going to be smoking this, and if I have a genetic vulnerability to psychosis, I don't want to be smoking marijuana because I'm concerned that I might develop psychotic symptoms. So it's a matter of understanding that part. Any questions so far from part 1? Any comments, anything like that? Okay. We'll talk about substance use and mental health now, the comorbidity. What we call concurrent disorders, because you will never have in mental health just only one problem. In life, you never have one problem, one area. When we get referrals in the health services for mental health, we get a primary diagnosis, a primary concern that we need to focus. And then we refer them accordingly to what the main concern is. But professionals need to be exposed to many different areas. We have models that are called case management model because they have to manage different things about a patient, you know? And one major of them, as you see here, bipolar addiction, personality addiction, anxiety addiction, depression addiction, is about psychoeducation, psychoeducating our patients and our families about substances. Because substances, most of the time, about 50 to 60% of the time, for those who have mental health problems, they have an addiction problem. So that means that if I have a patient that does have depression or anxiety, my number one part in terms of an intervention will be, I want to talk to them about addiction. I want to talk to them about substance, what it will do to the medication, what it will do to the symptoms, and how to manage it, how to control it. Because that could lead to exacerbating symptoms and making the illness worse and affecting the medication and the engagement into service as well and functioning. So those with a drug addiction or mental health, they are concurrent. And in any given year, 1 in 5 Canadians experience a mental health or addiction. And by the time Canadians reach 40 years of age, 1 in 2 have or have had a mental illness. And it goes both ways. A person with substance use could easily develop a mental health problem. A person with mental health problems could develop an addiction. When mental health and substance use disorders occur at the same time, it varies depending on the severity of the mental health, the substance consumed, the severity of the addiction problem. There are so many substances out there. We have pot, cannabis. We have hallucinogens like mushrooms. We have stimulants as well. We have so many that have an effect in the brain. And some of them could actually trigger some symptoms right away. Other ones, it takes some time. So why is it that in Canada it's a major problem when we talk about mental health concurrent disorders? Because they're the hardest ones to treat. That's why it's a major problem. It's so hard if I have a patient who has depression and addiction, that has psychosis and addiction. And most of the time, we have to make sure that we don't compartmentalize it. We cannot separate them. We have to be able, as a community, as a health system, to treat them at the same time, to work together. Because basically, we need to educate them to stabilize or try to manage the substance use at the same time as the symptoms. We can't just send them here and here and here and here. It's too much. So why? More than 50% of people seeking help of addiction also have concurrent mental health. 20 to 50% who consult for mental health problems also have a substance use. Adherence to treatment becomes difficult. More likelihood to relapse. Additional ER visits. Most of the ER visits usually happen and there is a substance use component. More difficulties in engaging patients into services. They get intoxicated the night before and they're unable to come for the appointment. They just prefer to continue smoking, they forget, there's a lot. Plus they have the mental health, so it definitely becomes more difficult. So we see four different squares here in terms of like different presentations of cases. So we have someone using a recreational drug at the weekend, starts to experience low mood, substance misuse team lead with advice from mental health team. We have someone who consumes heroin, there's substance misuse team lead, advice support for mental health. These are just examples in terms of like how idealistic they should be, the presentation of cases where we have a substance use specialist, we have a mental health team specialist. 70% of mental health problems have their onset during childhood or adolescence, and young people aged 15 to 24 are more likely to experience mental illness or substance use disorders than any other age group. So we need to have really a team of different experts working together. But it's not only a mental health system problem, it's also a community concern. That's why it's so important, education. That's why it's so important that it starts from what happens at home, to what happens at school, to what happens to people when they're not at home or school, workplace, before it reaches the stage of what we call the reactive approach, when there's a problem and then mental health services get involved. Cannabis and mental health. Cannabis use is not directly related to the onset of most prevalent mental health disorders, but there is an indirect association and continued research is done in the field. We can't say there is a causality. We can't say there is. What it does is actually triggering some symptoms, and there's a lot of factors, as I said before, that could be related to the onset of mental health. Substance is just an additional trigger to it. A younger age of onset of substance use can increase, though, the risk of mental health problems substantially. Chronic heavy use of cannabis has been shown to trigger psychotic symptoms in vulnerable individuals. So that's what I'm saying. You always have the vulnerability factor, the substance use, especially if it's an early age, and then any other factors that can make it even worse. Because you always wonder, and we always wonder in the community, why is that we have one person that consumes the same amount, another person's amount, but one falls into this trajectory and one falls into the positive trajectory. So we can't always say there's a causation, but we can always say there's an association or something triggering it. And it all comes down to also what I said before, risk factors and protective factors. What the person has been embedded in genetically and in terms of the environment. Cannabis may precipitate the onset of psychotic disorders, and continuous use may worsen the outcome. I'm going to show you a video on comorbidity.
Drug use problems are often associated with health harms. Infectious diseases such as HIV, AIDS, and hepatitis C have clear links to drug use. But there are also links between drug use and mental health problems that we need to consider. People with problematic forms of drug use often suffer from both a substance use and a mental health disorder. The coexistence of a substance use and a mental health disorder in the same person is usually called psychiatric comorbidity in substance users, or dual diagnosis. There aren't many figures on the extent of mental health disorders among drug users, but the numbers affected can be very high, up to 80% in certain groups of drug treatment patients. Depression is the most common mental health disorder associated with substance use, but anxiety is also often seen, and comorbid substance use disorders are more common in people with psychosis. Compared with people who have only a drug use or a mental health problem, people with comorbidity have more emergency admissions to general hospitals and to psychiatric hospitals, and more of them commit suicide. Substance use and mental health disorders are interlinked in different ways, which are sometimes overlapping. In some cases, a mental health disorder can be considered a risk factor for drug use, which may lead to the development of a substance use disorder. In other cases, drug use can trigger the development of a mental health disorder. Clinical practice has also shown that comorbid disorders often interact to make each other worse. It is often difficult to diagnose comorbidity among drug users. For example, in a person entering drug treatment, acute psychiatric symptoms might be attributed to their drug use, or the effects of withdrawal or intoxication from drugs may be misinterpreted as psychiatric illness. Patients need careful diagnosis and integrated treatment, where the two disorders are treated at the same time with professionals from both fields working together. Providing this level of care is a major challenge for policymakers, professionals, and clinicians.
Earlier, it is a major challenge for policymakers and for clinicians. As I was saying, it's not easy, but we know the research is there, and certainly health system is more aware of that day by day. So things are changing. Brief summary of different drug groups and classification. I'm not going to go into all details. I have to say that when I go in the community and I do give training or presentations to health professionals on this domain, I do go in more detail. But because of time, I'm only going to be focusing on the major ones, which is alcohol and cannabis. But there are different classes, and the effects are listed here, and the risk as well. And they are divided based on what it leads to. For example, stimulants, we have amphetamine and cocaine. We have opioids, which right now is actually one of the major concerns for the health system as well, the overdose of opioids. We hear about fentanyl, a lot of the news, and so on. Hallucinogens, and then we have marijuana. Marijuana is usually separated because it could go either way. It could go as a depressant at times, but it could also go as a hallucinogen because it does lead to psychotic symptoms. I'm going to explain a little bit about Ritalin and tranquilizers and all that, because certainly we know they're out there, and sometimes they're being even exposed and dealt illegally. So one thing about tranquilizers, most of the common ones is usually Xanax, Valium, and so on, and benzos, of course, as well. Then Ritalin as well is commonly used as a stimulant, and even though it's prescribed for ADHD, sometimes we have cases where some parents may access even from their kids for get high, basically. So we have to be aware that there may be some medication out there that is being used for recreational purposes and even sold illegally as well. So sometimes when we work in mental health services, we do screen for those type of substances as well. Okay, so then we go into drug classification, and the way we classify it is based on the purity of the product, how is it absorbed, the administration, which if it's inhaled or injected, the age of the person, their degree of habituation, the genetic background, and the context of consumption. Sometimes some substances are being mixed, and that makes it more potent in the brain and the effects and behavior. Some people are more vulnerable, as I mentioned earlier, genetics, the age of exposure, and drug abuse and addiction increase the risk of other mental illnesses, causes dysfunctional behaviors that can interfere with the functioning of a person socially, in terms of how they interact with their family and their friends, and occupationally, meaning at work, school. But one key factor, when something becomes a problem, we have to be aware that it's not just the person is missing work or missing school. A person will still be able to manage to go to work or to school, but if we notice that that person is not performing the same as before, then we start noticing signs of an impairment in their functioning. And that's key, because sometimes it could be that you have a colleague or you have someone at school or one of your kids, you're noticing some irritability, or you're noticing, they're waking up, they're going to school, but their grades are declining, or their complaints from the teacher, or their behavior at school is changing as well. So those are usually signs, not necessarily just for substance use, but any changes in behavior. So we always have to look at the beginning, how this person was before and how this person is progressively changing. Cannabis, so this is the clear appearance. It can come usually in oil form, brownies, cake, as a paste, and the appearance is leaves, steams, dry flowers. It can be smoked, inhaled, or occasionally swallowed. And the myths versus facts. I thought this was a good one, because we have to think that sometimes these are the main myths that we get sometimes in the community and our teenagers. The marijuana is not addictive, that there's no long-term effects of marijuana use. The marijuana is a treatment for mental health disorders. The marijuana is a safe drug for teenagers. The facts are 1 in 6 teenagers become addicted, and this addiction, like addiction to alcohol or cigarettes, affects neural mechanisms underlying tolerance, changes the reward system in the brain, and is associated with a withdrawal symptom. The marijuana used before age 18 may affect the IQ, learning, and memory. The current state of science does not show the benefits of smoked marijuana for psychological conditions. In fact, marijuana use likely worsens symptoms, and nearly all negative effects of marijuana, from brain changes to neurocognitive deficits, addictive potentially are worse in teenage than in adults. What we don't know is why some people become addicted while others not. Like I said before, the two trajectories. We don't know that. There is some hypothesis, but it always comes down to, as I said, risk and protective factors and how each person is built and they're able to deal with stressors. How long-lasting these effects are and whether they resolve after abstinence, whether scientists will someday discover therapeutic components of cannabis that can be extracted and purified, and how differences in mental health, level of exposure to marijuana, and use of other substances affect marijuana-related harm. The effects of cannabis. Short-term, memory, concentration, well-being, ion skip perception, reflexes, creativity, bloodshot eyes, extreme hunger, increased heart rate, talkativeness. Long-term, bronchitis, lung cancer, decreased concentration, caring, and memory, decreased production of hormones, and mental problems. The duration of the effects varies from one person to another one, but there's an increased risk, and also some people may not be aware of this, but in terms of marijuana, a joint can be as harmful as smoking from 4 to 10 cigarettes. Regular use of cannabis can cause throat cancer, lung, risk of respiratory infections, increase the risk of asthma attacks in people with these diseases. On behavioral judgment, the risk of injury due to a lack of coordination in terms of balance, having unprotected sex that may result in unplanned pregnancy or sexually transmitted infections, taking actions that may harm himself or harm others, by sometimes even with a friend or family member. And there is psychological dependence in connection with secure injustice, and there's a time of decrease stopping as well. And there is very much rare cases of overdose with cannabis. But the one thing with cannabis is that with increased consumption, it can definitely trigger an ER admission, just because the behavior could drastically change. But there's nothing like very rare overdoses occur. So there's confusion, excitement, anxiety, and paranoia, and psychosis, and that's mostly what leads to hospitalization. Now, alcohol. The appearance, we're very familiar with it. Liquid, drink, increase the risk of accidents of all kinds significantly when combined with other drugs, highly associated with road accidents and violence. The effects of alcohol, relaxation, euphoria, agitation, slowdown of movements, pasty mouth. Now with overdoses, it occurs, and that's the one area that is of a concern. Coordination problems, slow pulse, confusion, leads to respiratory depression, coma, and eventually really a person passing out. So that's what is important to be aware about alcohol. Now, my question to you, why are substances consumed, and why those who start regular consumption, do they continue using at high frequency? We know the effects. People are aware. But why? Why is it that the general population, they consume and they continue? What are the reasons? Form of escape. When a person has a drink, why is that person drink? Yes. They like it. They like it. Yeah. What else? Yes, relaxes them. They like it. What else? Takes away inhibitions. Yeah. Anything else? When you're at a party and you get a drink, why are you drinking at a party? It's a social thing. It's a social thing. Inhibition is a social thing. Okay, very good. What is it that us as humans are always looking and searching in life? What is the ultimate goal? Pleasure. Yeah. Happiness, pleasure. We're feeling good. But how do we seek for it? Do we work hard for it sometimes? Or do we want to have an easy fix? Let's be realistic here. Most of the time, we're not feeling good. We want to feel great, right? And it's not easy sometimes when you have a bad day and you just want to feel great already, like you just need to like internalize it, look at these things, and then like, do you go for the option of just like maybe just like, distracting yourself, maybe putting your gym stuff on, go for a run, or going to this party and so that. Or sometimes you just feel like when I just get a drink, just relax, and that could become repetitive. It could become a habit. Because we like pleasure, we like to feel good, we like it, we like to feel happy. Happiness is a choice that requires effort at times, I say. Each of us have to have the willpower to work at it. I'm not saying it's going to be just like this magic, journey of we're going to do A to Z perfection. No, I'm not saying that. I have alcohol. I have my glass of wine here and there. That's perfectly fine. That is perfectly fine, I say. But then I have to know, where is my limits? Where is it I can control it? Also, I'm not a teenager anymore. I'm an adult. I'm making that choice with judgment, hopefully, most of the time. But then I have to be aware, okay, this is how I see that this will affect my health eventually. I have to know when I'm going to stop and when is it too much and when it's too little. That's what is important. And also, we need to work at it. We need to work our brain as best as we can to make it strong. So how is it that we can do that? Now, reasons for alcohol and drug consumption in our youth. And that's, like I said, the precious group. And mental health is a precious group. Or seniors are the precious group. And our youth say this to us. Feel good, to have higher confidence level, to forget problems, to cope with unpleasant feelings, to socialize with others, to escape reality. This type of consumption can become a habit, which is difficult to change. My question to you is, are there any other ways that a youth or us or anyone can reach all the 6 areas without regular consumption of, I'm not saying abstinence completely, okay? I'm not putting that message. I don't want to put that message out there because it's a choice. But we have to be aware of it. The 6 there, how could we reach that without constant and regular consumption of alcohol, let's say on a Friday or a Saturday, you just feel like drinking? Because that could become really detrimental later on in your physical health and mental health. You may not feel it right now, but believe me, years go by, you will feel it. You will go to the doctor, you will feel it. So how could we reach all this, tell our youth or ourselves to reach all this? What do you think? How could we feel good? How are we going to have a higher confidence level? How could we forget about our problems? How could we cope with unpleasant feelings or socialize with others to escape reality? Yes. Exercise. Do an activity you enjoy. What else? Meditation. What else? Sorry? Friends. Engage. Yes. What else? Learning. Learning is learn how to cook. Yes, learn how to cook. Learn something new. Learn something challenging. Learn something that you don't know already. Keep yourself busy. Distraction is key. Busy is key. I'm not saying busy to the point you're going to a burnout. I'm saying busy to the point where you always make a list of things that you really enjoy, because the things that you may not be so pleasant that you have to do, we all have to have them. But if you add things that you really like to the list, it makes it more manageable, all the other things, right? Okay, very good. Long-term alcohol and drug use can affect the functioning of the brain. People who are physically addicted and who suddenly stop taking alcohol or drugs can experience distressing withdrawal symptoms. And the key, changes in the brain can be permanent. This may be the reasons why people continue to consume alcohol or drugs and relapse. Substance use changes the brain. Once the brain is changed, it's very difficult to modify that area that was affected. But there is hope. There is hope that other areas in the brain can actually be transformed and can be stimulated. That's what is important to understand, that our brain is malleable. It can be changed, adapted every time. But once you affect one area, that area, you have neurons that unfortunately, they die and you can't get them back. But you can make other connections. Other connections in the brain can be made at any age. At any age, you can stimulate your brain and make new connections to make it stronger so you can deal with the pathways that are already very weak. You know how amazing that is? I always get excited about science. I do. I get excited because I always say to people that you can take charge and control of your brain. You just don't know it. You just don't feel it. You are in charge of doing everything you can to that brain. You just have to choose the right things. You have to learn. Learning is one major thing that makes new connections. Because that person can feel very good right now, but if I'm not constantly stimulating my brain, how am I going to be able to deal with a major stressor if I have in 1 year from here, I have a major death in my family or major trauma, or who knows? You never know what's going to happen. You need to work at this and building yourself and growth to be able to face challenges all the time, to be able to remain happy in life and move forward with life and having the right attitude. So learning is one major of them. But I'm not saying about just any learning, and we're going to talk about that. It's about a very specific type of learning. So how substances affect the brain? What is the neurobiological basis of addiction? This is our brain. It's a beautiful entity. It looks colorful here. It's not colorful inside of our heads. But all I can tell you is that it does wonders. And all the areas there, they're all interconnected. The moment that you touch something, the moment that you smell something, the moment that you think something, there's like wiring happening like a million in there. So imagine that. Every single movement, every single emotion, there is a bunch of signaling happening. So it's all synchronized and harmonized beautifully. And it all reaches homeostasis if there is natural intake and natural outtake of the activities. But if you insert something that is from the outside that would affect that harmonization, then it's trouble. So that's why when we talk about dementia, we know that there's specific plaques in the brain that unfortunately starts destroying specific areas in the brain slowly. The major sign is memory loss, but then you see progression of different symptoms, right? You see executive functioning being damaged, you see motor functioning as well. You also see how they're able to make decisions or how they forget how to cook, how to do things. So all of that is areas in the parietal lobe, in the temporal lobe. The occipital vision too gets destroyed. So it's a progression of symptoms because everything is connected. If one neuron gets killed, that signal is not going to another area of the brain. So if someone consumes a substance, what it's doing is affecting one area, but also everything else. And that's what is important to understand. And it comes down to the reward system. I'm not going to go into detail. I'm going to show you a video that summarizes basically what is it. And I feel that, yes, it's a lot of biology, but I think it's important to understand that if we have someone who has mental health, we have someone who has addiction, the brain has changed and they need a lot of support from us and a lot of guidance because sometimes they're very much unable to make the decisions for themselves because the brain has changed. I'm not saying that they shouldn't take responsibility. I think each person should. But we have to be patient in terms of even and not lose hope on being what I call a parent in terms of being repetitive. You feel that sometimes repetition, I say that also to health professionals. Repetition may just feel like you're just like a recording machine and you get frustrated, you record. Yes, but that's what sometimes they need. Because it could be that maybe from, let's say, 10 people that you know, maybe 1 or 2 will react to what you're saying. Or maybe that one person you're talking to, you think it's not listening, but maybe eventually it will get the message. So certainly it's a lot for caregivers, and it's a lot for health professionals, but it's needed.
Addiction is a neurological disorder that affects the reward system in the brain. In a healthy person, the reward system reinforces important behaviors that are essential for survival, such as eating, drinking, sex, and social interaction. For example, the reward system ensures that you reach for food when you are hungry because you know that after eating you will feel good. In other words, it makes the activity of eating pleasurable and memorable, so you would want to do it again and again whenever you feel hungry. Drugs of abuse hijack this system, turning the person's natural needs into drug needs. The brain consists of billions of neurons, or nerve cells, which communicate via chemical messages, or neurotransmitters. When a neuron is sufficiently stimulated, an electrical impulse called an action potential is generated and travels down the axon to the nerve terminal. Here it triggers the release of a neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft, a space between neurons. The neurotransmitter then binds to a receptor on a neighboring neuron, generating a signal in it, thereby transmitting the information to that neuron. The major reward pathways involve transmission of the neurotransmitter dopamine from the ventral tegmental area, the VTA, of the midbrain to the limbic system and the frontal cortex. Engaging in enjoyable activities generates action potentials in dopamine-producing neurons of the VTA. This causes dopamine release from the neurons into the synaptic space. Dopamine then binds to and stimulates dopamine receptor on the receiving neuron. This stimulation by dopamine is believed to produce the pleasurable feelings or rewarding effects. Dopamine molecules are then removed from the synaptic space and transported back into the transmitting neuron by a special protein called dopamine transporter. Most drugs of abuse increase the level of dopamine in the reward pathway. Some drugs such as alcohol, heroin, and nicotine indirectly excite the dopamine-producing neurons in the VTA so that they generate more action potentials. Cocaine acts at the nerve terminal. It binds to dopamine transporter and blocks the reuptake of dopamine. Methamphetamine, a psychostimulant, acts similarly to cocaine in blocking dopamine removal. In addition, it can enter the neuron into the dopamine-containing vesicles, where it triggers dopamine release even in the absence of action potentials. Different drugs act in different ways, but the common outcome is that dopamine builds up in the synapse to a much greater amount than normal. This causes a continuous stimulation, maybe overstimulation of receiving neurons, and is responsible for prolonged and intense euphoria experienced by drug users. Repeated exposure to dopamine surges caused by drugs eventually desensitizes the reward system. The system is no longer responsive to everyday stimuli. The only thing that is rewarding is the drug. That is how drugs change the person's life priority. After some time, even the drug loses its ability to reward, and higher doses are required to achieve the rewarding effect. This ultimately leads to drug overdose.
High tolerance for it, and they need to keep up trying to reach that level of high, and they need more and more and more and more, so they can't control it. So basically we call the drug has hijacked the brain completely, has taken control of it. So basically, cocaine, ecstasy, tobacco, caffeine as well, but they're minor stimulants, meaning that they won't affect functioning to a degree that is major. It will have physical consequences, but functioning in terms of behavior not. But alcohol, heroin, and psychoactive substances, all of this that trigger addiction have a common property. They increase the amount of dopamine in the brain. Here we have a brain of a normal 43-year-old and someone who's a chronic alcoholic with 43 years old. So what's the difference in the two brains here? What do you see? There are pockets, right? There are pockets or empty space. So in that area, there are no longer those connections that we spoke about. They're gone. So imagine that. Imagine how, the second question, how does this person function? The prefrontal cortex, you see areas that are gone. You see the temporal lobe areas are gone. The occipital, which is related to vision, they're gone. So that's why sometimes you see chronic alcoholism already starts deteriorating the motor function. People start, like their speech also starts to deteriorate, right? So it's a lot of areas that you see that have changed. My question is there hope? Do you think there is hope for someone that's chronic? That means like it's been years. The person probably started at age 15, but it's been so consistent that to the point that they need even a drink to wake up in the morning to get them going, because alcohol allows them to function, okay? This type of brain won't be done if you get intoxicated a few times. Alcohol does kill cells in one hangover, yes, but if you repetitively do it, then this would happen. So is there hope? What do you think? Yes? Good. Yes, I do believe there is hope. And it comes down to what we spoke before about making new connections. Doesn't mean that the person may be completely recovered in terms of getting those areas back. No. But by learning or by making new connections and by building an approach where the person is able to stay active and do things and have a team that encourages them to do so, family support and all of that, then certainly the person could become functional, could be able to deal with life. Risk and protective factors. What are the areas that put someone more at risk? And that's important because all of us, we have in our lives people that we know that may be more at risk for developing addiction. Can we each find ways to protect from the course of an illness? We have genetics versus environmental factors. So one area is family. One area is social support. The other area is our own personality. The other area, when we talk about youth, is education as well. And the other area is our community policies made to put us not so much at risk. So risk factors, we have personal, we have, when we look at a teenager, we look at behavioral disorders, we have a rebellious spirit, that's a risk factor, a difficult temperament. Doesn't mean the person will go into that direction. I'm saying these are risk factors that put you more into the area of maybe going into a behavior that could be drastically changed. Lack of interest for school failures, the age of onset of consumption as well. Then we have the family environment, the presence of family conflicts, inadequate parental behavior, the frequency of deviant peers, a family member who has inappropriate consumption. And then we have the social environments that put someone at risk. Permissive standards and the valorization of certain consumption patterns, policy legislation, social exclusion, policy legislation that directly and indirectly affect the financial, physical, and legal accessibility of substances may encourage aggravation, poverty, and disintegration of neighborhoods. I highlight this area because everything else is what a person comes with, grew up with. The other areas, more or less, it can be changed in terms of risk factors. Now, here's what we can take charge of, protective factors. And I highlighted two major ones, actually this one too. This one is key for everything in life. This one too, and this one too. Coping, the ability to do things, to adapt to a given situation in any given time, protects you. Using internal resource of knowing how to ask for outside help. Resilience, the normal process of developing despite difficult conditions. When someone has a traumatic event in life, and I'm talking about, it could be major, sexual abuse, maybe they went to war, they suffer from PTSD, any major one, how can a person get out of that and have a normal life? We see people that went through the Holocaust that they wrote incredible books, right? We know people that are, right now they're going through major similar experiences in other areas of the world. We look at Venezuela, we looked at what's going on in the Middle East, so much, right? How can those people go on with their lives and be able to protect themselves to not go into mental health or an addiction? Coping ability to do things, to adapt, to make sure that your brain gets challenged every single day and gets registered that this is a challenge right now today. I'm going to push myself, but I'm going to get out of it and I'm going to register in my brain that. Because that's what you do into your brain every time you actually do something that is challenging. And I'm talking about really challenging. You're pushing your brain and you're making those connections and saying to your brain, hey, you can deal with anything. Having a good support network is key. And we say a lot this, and we try to say this to our patients, to really try to build a network, try to change your network. There's so much in social media right now that we can also use it in a positive way, not negative. And there's a lot of Facebook in terms of community groups for running, community groups from art, community here, to sign up our community into being exposed to other people, learning from other people, and meeting other people that could have a positive influence. And just to have a plan. I want to make new friends. Why not? Why not get a new social support? Join a group, join a club, and it doesn't have to be expensive. You can just actually make that plan for everyone and have a purpose. A role and a recognition, a sense of belonging to the community and a commitment to its values makes a person find a purpose on why is it that I'm here in life. I'm here in life to, yes, be here for my family, for myself. What about me? Let's do something. Let's do a few things that actually will stimulate me and make me a better person and transmit that. That is so important. So we highlight those and we encourage our community youth to really try to work at this. Number 6, differences among substance use, at-risk behavior, and those with established problems. How to identify the signs. We have 3 different groups. Consumption, we know it's out there, people consume. The guidelines say a person becomes at risk of developing a substance use with alcohol if they consume more than 10 standard drinks per week for women, more than 15 standard drinks for men, and there are some areas of functioning that you already see being affected. And by some areas, I mean not necessarily the person stopped going to work, not necessarily the person stop and isolate themselves in the house, no. You know the people around you very well. You can tell the person starts increasing alcohol. You can tell their sleep starts to change. You can tell their mood starts to change. You can tell the person starts forgetting things. And you can tell that the person is already acting up and responding to you in a specific way. And you relate those. Then abuse and dependence, addiction, they're not easy to diagnose. A person, you need to look at the whole year pattern. You have to look at the pattern of behavior because substance fluctuates over time. Some people stop, some people start, some people stop, start. So we always look at the whole year. So when you look at a person and you think that a person has a problem, you have to look at the repetition of behavior. If I know someone where my neighbor, the police gets called at least twice, and there's a substance use component, that person has an abuse. That person is already developing a problem. That already goes in the criteria. If I know of someone who's constantly forgetting to pick up their kids or drop them off at the school bus because that person was drinking the night before, that person is already developing a problem. Definitely. Addiction becomes, the drug becomes addictive when you have a physiological need to it. Psychological, physiological. The person needs to function. The person tries to stop using it, but they can't. They want to. They have the willpower, but they can't. The drug has taken over. They can't. They try to decrease it. With tobacco, it's the same thing. So many people want to stop smoking cigarettes, but it's tough. Why? Because there's changes in the brain that has already been made because of the reward system that has been really triggered, as we explained before, with tobacco. So it's not only about, a lot of people say, oh, it's because she doesn't have enough willpower. No, the person has the willpower. It's just that it's the biological basis of it. That's why they need a lot of coaching and a lot of support and a lot of that. Guidelines, like I said before, 1 standard drink is listed out there. You can easily find it as well, what it's equivalent to. With a glass of wine, it's 5 ounces. That's 1 standard drink. So if a person has about 10 of those per week, already is in the line of at risk if there's some areas of functioning being disrupted. 3, I'm saying at risk. I'm not saying they have a problem. I'm saying at risk. At risk, frequent consumption, problematic consumption, and then it comes down to abuse and dependence. So we always have those patterns in substance use. And I'm going to just briefly show you how we screen. Right now we're trying to implement all of this gradually. The criteria for dependence as well, that is very detailed, as I said before. It's not easy to be met, but it is met. Okay, thank you everyone.